Welcome to Behind the Dynasty, where history speaks for itself. Today, we're diving into the story of one of the most controversial figures in Chinese history, a man loved and hated for 2,000 years. This is Cao Cao. Cao Cao, wronged for 2,000 years? The truth behind China's greatest villain. Part 1. One name, 2,000 years of lies. What if the man branded as the greatest villain in Chinese history actually saved more lives than any of the so-called heroes of his age? Would you believe it? On the stages of Beijing Opera, his face is painted chalk white, the color reserved for the treacherous and the wicked. In the novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms, he is the living embodiment of every dark scheme a ruler could devise. But in the actual historical record, the portrait is completely different. Try a thought experiment. Ask 100 people in China about Cao Cao, pronounced Cao Cao. 99 will say the same thing: cunning, paranoid, brutal. They will tell you about the time he murdered Liu Boshe's family by mistake. They will quote that infamous line, "I would rather betray the world than let the world betray me." They will describe the chalk-white face on stage. But ask them what Cao Cao did for the millions starving across northern China. Ask what reforms he made. Ask what economic legacy he left. Most will stare at you blankly, because nobody ever taught them. Here is the strange part. Cao Cao was not always despised. Emperor Taizong of Tang, Li Shimin, arguably the greatest emperor in Chinese history, openly praised him as a supreme talent. This was recorded in his ceremonial eulogy for Cao Cao, found in the Tran Tang Wen, the complete Tang texts. For centuries after Cao Cao's death, historians judged him fairly. A brilliant commander, a masterful politician, a poet with a deep and restless soul. The wind shifted during the Song dynasty and reached gale force under the Ming. The Song founders seized power by usurping the later Zhou throne. The Ming overthrew the Mongol Yuan dynasty to restore Han Chinese rule. Both desperately needed to reinforce the idea that dynastic legitimacy was sacred. Anyone who challenged it was a villain for eternity. They needed a symbol of absolute loyalty to the throne. Liu Bei, pronounced Liu Bei, who claimed descent from the Han imperial family, was cast in that role. The connection was so remote that many historians doubt it. But no matter. For a saint to shine, you need a devil dark enough to stand behind him. Cao Cao became the perfect sacrifice. But if we strip away the thick layers of fiction and stage paint, who was the real Cao Mengde? A treasonous usurper who stole the Han dynasty? Or a reformer who kept half of China from falling into the abyss? A paranoid butcher? Or a lonely visionary 1,000 years ahead of his time? A man who paid for that vision with his reputation for all eternity? To answer that, we need to go back to the era that forged him. A time when blood flowed more freely than the Yellow River, when people ate each other to survive, when every moral principle collapsed under the weight of a nation's screaming. Part 2. The Fall of Eastern Han, the crucible that made a villain. Nobody is born wearing the chalk-white face of the opera stage. Nobody enters this world wanting blood on their hands. Cao Cao was shaped by the age he lived in, and that age was brutal beyond imagination. Around the year 180 CE, China was arguably the largest and most sophisticated civilization on Earth, rivaled only by the Roman Empire on the other side of the continent. The Han dynasty governed roughly 60 million people, comparable to Rome at its height. The two never knew the other existed. They were the twin pillars of the ancient world. But while Rome would take centuries to crumble, China's collapse came fast and catastrophic. The Eastern Han Dynasty was in its death throes. The Son of Heaven, Emperor Ling, was a puppet. Court eunuchs monopolized every channel of information and turned him into a prisoner in his own palace. They surrounded him in a golden cage where every report from the outside world was filtered, distorted, or simply blocked. The emperor saw only what they wanted him to see.
Government positions were sold openly, listed with actual prices, like items at an auction. The going rate for a provincial governorship was roughly 20 million coins. The first thing every new official did was recover the investment. How? By squeezing the peasants. The cycle of destruction spun faster every year. Now imagine a farmer named Ah Qi, somewhere in Hebei province along the Yellow River. He has already lost his father to plague. His youngest child died during the last famine. And now the tax collector arrives again, demanding grain that does not exist. Ah Qi looks at his remaining family, his wife, his surviving son, and knows that if he pays, they starve. If he refuses, the soldiers will take it anyway. This was not one man's misfortune. This was the daily reality for millions across the Han Empire. The system was not failing these people. The system was designed to consume them. In 184, that cycle exploded. Hundreds of thousands of peasants, heads wrapped in yellow scarves, rose up under Zhang Ju. He was a faith healer who blended Taoist mysticism with revolutionary politics. Their slogan, "Cang Tian Yi Si, Huang Tian Dang Li." The blue sky of Han is dead. The yellow sky shall rise. Think of it as a peasant army the size of Spartacus's revolt, but organized and erupting simultaneously across multiple provinces. Men like Ah Qi did not care about theology or politics. They needed one reason not to starve to death. Zhang Ju gave them that reason. To crush the rebellion, the court allowed local governors to raise their own armies. Central authority disintegrated overnight. In 189, Emperor Ling died. The empress's clan and the eunuch faction slaughtered each other. Then Dong Zhuo, a frontier warlord with a battle-hardened army, stormed the capital. What Dong Zhuo did to Luoyang deserves a moment of silence. This was not merely a military occupation. It was the deliberate annihilation of a civilization's memory. Luoyang was the greatest city in the Eastern world, home to the imperial archives, the Great Academy, libraries holding tens of thousands of bamboo scrolls and silk manuscripts accumulated over centuries. Dong Zhuo's soldiers looted what they could carry and burned the rest. The imperial library, irreplaceable records of astronomy, medicine, philosophy, law, went up in flames. Centuries of accumulated knowledge gone in a single night. Then Dong Zhuo forced the entire population to march west to Chang'an. Picture it, millions of civilians driven at spear point through winter, stumbling past the burning ruins of everything they had ever known. The old collapsed on the road. Children were trampled underfoot. The soldiers took whatever they wanted: food, valuables, women. Refugees who fell behind were left to die. The road from Luoyang to Chang'an became a corridor of corpses. Cao Cao witnessed all of it. At this point, he was a minor official, the police chief of Luoyang's northern district. But the days when Luoyang burned changed him forever. A civilization built over 1,000 years, reduced to ash before his eyes. Men who preached righteousness, swinging swords at the innocent. And he understood. Confucian ideals cannot save anyone when order has collapsed. When the house is on fire, you do not sit around debating architecture. Late Eastern Han society was split to the bone. On one side stood the great aristocratic clans, families who judged a person's worth entirely by bloodline. The Yuan family was the prime example. 4 consecutive generations holding one of the 3 excellencies, the highest offices in the empire. Think of it as 4 generations of Supreme Court justices from the same family. These families controlled access to education, to political recommendation, to everything that mattered. If you were born into one, the doors of power stood open. If you were not, those doors were bolted shut. On the other side stood men of low birth, sons of farmers, sons of merchants, or, worst of all, descendants of eunuchs. Eunuchs. Castrated men who served in the imperial palace were considered barely human by the aristocracy. They held enormous power at court, but their families carried a permanent stigma. Cao Cao belonged here. His adoptive grandfather, the Grand Eunuch Cao Tung, had once been the most powerful man at court. But the aristocrats still treated Cao Cao as trash. His father bought his way into a high office. Money cannot buy respect. That 4-word curse, grandson of a eunuch, followed Meng De like a shadow. The famous personality evaluator Xu Xiao was asked to assess him. His verdict? A capable minister in an age of peace, a cunning hero in an age of chaos. Terrifyingly accurate. Xu Xiao saw a man unbound by convention, someone who could reinvent himself to match the times. It was the aristocracy's rejection that forged something different. Cao Cao saw through the rot behind the silk robes. Scholars who could recite the classics but could not manage a single county. Virtuous men who trembled at the sight of enemy soldiers. He despised all of it. And he swore to build a new world where people were judged by ability, not blood. In 190, a coalition of warlords formed to oppose Dong Zhuo. Yuan Shao, pronounced Yuan Shao, was elected leader. Cao Cao joined with a small force he had scraped together by spending his entire family fortune. But disillusionment came fast. The warlords held banquets, debated endlessly, and calculated what each would gain, while Dong Zhuo was very much still alive and well. Cao Cao was the only one who actually fought. He led his men in pursuit alone, clashed with the enemy at Xingyang, and nearly died. His horse was hit by an arrow. He himself was wounded. His cousin, Cao Hong, gave up his own horse so Meng De could escape. When he stumbled back to camp, blood still wet on his armor, he found the other warlords playing chess and drinking wine. Not one had moved. That was the moment everything crystallized. He could not rely on anyone. Not on ancestral prestige, because his ancestors were eunuchs. Not on loyalty, because every man served only his own ambition. The world had become a jungle. Only the strongest, the smartest, and the most ruthless would survive. He broke away. He chose his own path. A path built on the only 2 things that held real value in chaos: grain
and talent. That path would take him from nothing to ruler of half of China. But before we follow his rise, we need to understand the weapon that would destroy his legacy more thoroughly than any army: a novelist's pen. Part 3: Romance of the Three Kingdoms, a 1,000-year miscarriage of justice. Before we examine what Cao Cao actually did, we need to understand what was done to him. Without grasping the scale of this smear campaign, you cannot understand why the real man was buried so deep. In the 14th century, a writer named Luo Guangzhong put pen to paper on what would become one of the 4 great masterpieces of Chinese literature: Romance of the Three Kingdoms. In East Asia, it occupies roughly the same space that Homer's Iliad holds in Western civilization, combined with the popular reach of Game of Thrones. Generals studied it for strategy. Politicians studied it for statecraft. For hundreds of millions of readers across centuries, this book was the lens through which they understood their own history. But this book is not a history. It is a historical novel, built on real events, but shaped and distorted according to the author's agenda. Luo Guangzhong had a clear agenda: elevate Liu Bei into a saint and condemn Cao Cao as a demon. This was the product of a centuries-long ideological movement during the Song and Ming dynasties. Honor Liu, condemn Cao. Liu Bei was elevated into the symbol of righteous rule. And to make a candle burn bright, you need deep enough darkness. Cao Cao became that darkness. Luo Guangzhong's technique was devastatingly sophisticated. He did not deny Cao Cao's talent. He acknowledged it. But he transformed that talent into something demonic. Decisiveness became cruelty. Strategic vision became cunning. Existential anguish became cold calculation. The genius remained intact. The soul was swapped out. The most famous example is the Lu Boshi incident, perhaps the most consequential scene in all of Chinese literary history. Here is what the sources actually say. The records of the Three Kingdoms, the Sanguozhi, written by Chen Shou around 280 CE, is the closest thing we have to a primary source for this era. It mentions only briefly that Cao Cao grew suspicious and killed people by mistake. The annotator Pei Songzhi added more detail. Cao Cao was fleeing from Dongzhuo and took shelter at the home of Lu Boshi. The old man went out to buy wine. Cao Cao, mentally shattered after days of being hunted, heard knives being sharpened in the kitchen. In a survival reflex, he drew his sword and killed everyone. Then he discovered they had only been preparing a feast in his honor. He cried out, "I have wronged these people." A painful scar on a man's life, not a manifesto of evil. Pause on those words. I have wronged these people. 5 words heavy with regret. But under Luo Guangzhong's pen, this tragedy became deliberate cruelty. He added details. Cao Cao knew they were preparing a feast, but chose to kill them anyway. Then he killed Lu Boshi himself to silence the only witness. And I have wronged these people was rewritten into, I would rather betray the world than let the world betray me. With a single line, a tragedy born of fear became a mission statement of pure evil. A cry of regret became a philosophy of life. 2 attitudes separated by an ocean.
The power of fiction lies in its ability to create images that can never be erased. When hundreds of millions of people read this novel across centuries, the image of an opera villain with a sinister smile replaced the real man entirely. Luo Guanzhong employed an even subtler weapon: strategic omission. He simply ignored the good, ignored the farming colonies that saved vast numbers of lives, ignored the poetry overflowing with compassion, ignored the meritocratic reforms. Instead, he magnified military schemes and turned every event into a morality play. People prefer stories about villains over studies of administrators. They prefer the drama of conspiracy over the dry details of tax policy. And so the literary Cao Cao swallowed the historical Cao Cao whole. It spat out a ghost that has haunted the world's imagination for 600 years. If you lived in that era, what would you trust? The historical record or the play that everyone around you was performing? Now that we understand how fiction buried the real Cao Cao, let's dig him back up, starting with the most controversial political gamble of his career. Part 4. Welcoming the Emperor: Genius Strategy or Act of Treason. After leaving the warlord coalition in 190, Cao Cao spent 6 grueling years rebuilding from nothing. 6 years of fighting, building, failing, and getting back up. He defeated the remnants of the Yellow Turban rebels in Yan province. He absorbed tens of thousands of their battle-hardened soldiers, former insurgents retrained into the backbone of his army. In 196, the opportunity of a lifetime appeared. Emperor Shiyan of Han, Liu Xie, the last emperor of the Eastern Han, was wandering through the ruins of Luoyang. The ruler of all under heaven could not afford a single decent meal. He was eating husks to survive. His courtiers were ragged, starving, weeping as they looked at one another. Picture the scene more closely. This was a boy, not yet 20 years old, who had been tossed between warlords like a piece of luggage since childhood. His eyes carried the hollow terror of someone who had watched men slaughtered in the halls of his own palace. The remnants of Dong Zhuo's army were still hunting him. His ministers had no soldiers, no food, no walls to hide behind. The Son of Heaven, in theory the supreme authority on earth, was sleeping by the roadside, surrounded by a handful of ragged loyalists who had nowhere else to go. The imperial seal, which commanded the obedience of 60 million people a generation earlier, now dangled from the neck of a starving teenager stumbling through rubble. That was the state of the Han Dynasty in 196.
Would you take him in? Most warlords wouldn't. Yuan Shao, who controlled the largest territory and the strongest army, dismissed the idea. Why burden yourself with a washed-up emperor? That decision was the most catastrophic mistake of his life. Cao Cao saw what Yuan Shao could not. He did not see a burden. He saw a weapon more powerful than any sword or army. The Han Dynasty may have been crumbling, but 400 years of rule do not fade easily. Think of the Roman Senate in the late Empire, a hollow shell, yet the name still commanded mystical respect. No barbarian king could manufacture that with force alone. Or think of the papacy in medieval Europe. Even when individual popes were corrupt, the office itself carried authority that kings needed. In Chinese political philosophy, this concept is called the mandate of heaven. The shadow of that mandate, however faint, still carried weight that no warlord could forge from scratch. Meng De brought Emperor Xian to Shu, his new capital. He implemented the strategy known as Feng Tianzi Yiling Zhuhou, serve the Son of Heaven and command the lords in his name. Think of it as becoming the Pope's chief advisor during the medieval period. You do not wear the crown yourself, but every decree that matters goes through you. The most important word is Feng, to serve. In the historical record, Cao Cao served the emperor. But Romance of the Three Kingdoms swapped Feng for Xie, to coerce, to hold hostage. One character changed, the entire meaning inverted. Serving the Son of Heaven is the act of a loyal minister. Holding the Son of Heaven hostage is the act of a usurper. One word, a stroke of genius, became a criminal indictment. But did it actually work? Beyond the theory, what happened in practice? The results were transformative. The stigma of his birth vanished overnight. Every order he issued came in the emperor's name. Every war he launched was officially a campaign to punish rebels. He transformed himself from a player on the board into the person who controlled the rules. He was not just playing the game better than his opponents, he was redefining the game itself. But legitimacy cannot feed an army. Every imperial decree in the world is worth less than a single grain of rice when soldiers' stomachs are empty. And this is where Cao Cao did something no other warlord conceived. A revolution fought not with swords, but with plows. Part 5. The Military Farm System, the quiet revolution that saved millions. When Cao Cao welcomed Emperor Xian to Shu, he also welcomed an enormous burden. Thousands of officials, soldiers, and the machinery of the imperial court, all descending on a region already devastated by war. Northern China at this point was an open-air graveyard. According to census records cited in the Book of Later Han, the empire's registered population peaked at roughly 60 million. By the time the wars ended decades later, estimates suggest it had plummeted to around 16 million, though historians debate whether this reflects actual deaths or mass displacement beyond census reach. Tens of millions perished from war, famine, and plague, a demographic catastrophe on par with the Black Death in Europe. Along the Yellow River, fields that had once fed countless families were choked with weeds taller than a man. No sound of oxen plowing, no smoke rising from evening hearths. The Great Famine of Xingping had pushed humanity to its final limit. The histories record it in 4 cold characters. Yi zi e shi. They exchanged children and ate them. 4 characters, just 4, but heavy enough to crush every moral theory ever written. When a father must hand his own child to a stranger and eat the stranger's child in return, then anyone who dares to end that hell deserves to be heard. Most warlords solved the food problem the crude way: pillage. Strip the peasants of every kernel. The peasants, left with no seed grain, either became bandits or starved. Plunder was not a solution. It was a death spiral. Cao Cao chose a different path. In the autumn of 196, he issued the decree establishing the Tun Tian system, the military farming colonies. This was arguably the most important economic policy of the entire Three Kingdoms period, and also the least talked about. So why does nobody mention it? Because farming policy does not make for gripping drama. Conspiracy does. Betrayal does. A man handing out oxen and seed grain? Not exactly theater. The concept was not his invention. Han border troops had long combined garrison duty with farming. But Cao Cao was the first to scale it nationwide. He transformed a temporary frontier measure into systematic national reconstruction. The state reclaimed abandoned land and assigned it to displaced refugees. It provided oxen, seed grain, and tools. In return, farmers paid tax in kind. Those rates look harsh by modern standards. But when people are trading children for meat, being given land, oxen, seed, and military protection is survival. The peasants did not need abstract freedom. They needed food. He gave them food. He appointed Ren Jun and Zhao Zhi to manage the system. They divided it into two categories: civilian colonies, called Mintun, where displaced civilians farmed; military colonies, called Juntun, where soldiers trained and plowed in rotation. In peacetime, hang up the sword, pick up the hoe. When the enemy attacks, drop the hoe, draw the sword. Not unlike the Roman legionary system, where soldiers built roads and aqueducts between campaigns. Now let us follow one man through this system. Imagine a refugee named Ali. He lost his home and his entire family during the Yellow Turban Uprising. For months, he wandered, begging for scraps, sleeping in ditches. Twice, he nearly died, once from hunger, once from bandits. Then Cao Cao's officials found him on the road outside Shu. They did not conscript him into the army. They gave him a plot of abandoned land that had belonged to an aristocratic family now fled or dead. They gave him an ox, a bag of seed grain, and simple iron tools. In return, Ali owed 50% of his harvest to the state. If the ox was state-owned, 60%. By modern standards, crushing. But Ali had been eating bark and grass for 6 months. He had watched strangers roast human flesh by the roadside. The moment that first green shoot pushed through the soil on his assigned plot, Ali wept. Not from sadness, from the simple, almost forgotten sensation of having a future. He was no longer free in the way a philosopher might define freedom, but he was alive. His stomach was full. Soldiers patrolled the perimeter. No bandit could take what he had grown. For the first time in years, Ali slept through the night. Multiply Ali by tens of thousands. That was the Tuntian system. The results exceeded all expectations. After just 1 year at Shu, according to the Sanguozhi's biography of Emperor Wu, the granaries collected roughly 1 million hu of grain, enough to feed both the army and the court. From then on, every conquered territory received farming colonies immediately. His armies did not need long, vulnerable supply lines. Their food source was right beneath their feet. This was the decisive advantage at the Battle of Guandu in the year 200. According to the Sanguozhi, Yuan Shao's biography, Yuan Shao marched south with over 100,000 elite troops. Cao Cao had 30 to 40,000. On paper, Yuan Shao could not lose. But he lost. The critical reason? Logistics. Yuan Shao's army depended on grain transported over long distances. When Cao Cao burned the supply depot at Wuchao, Yuan Shao's forces disintegrated overnight. The farming colonies carried a deeper significance too. By making the state the sole landowner, Cao Cao shattered the power of the local aristocracy. Under the old system, peasants were tenants of great families. Cao Cao cut that cord. The state grants the land. The state collects the tax. No aristocratic middlemen. In modern terms, the Tuntian system was China's New Deal. The state directly creating employment and distributing resources to rescue the population. Except Cao Cao did it nearly 2,000 years before Franklin Roosevelt. The crisis was 100 times worse. He had no model to reference. Compare this with his rivals. Yuan Shu in the Huainan region only extracted wealth without investing in production. Within a few years, a fertile region became wasteland. Yuan Shu died in despair. Legend says he begged for honey water on his deathbed, but there was none to be had. Lu Bu in Shu province lived by plunder, eventually isolating himself until he was besieged and captured. While every other warlord treated grain as something to seize, Cao Cao was the only one who treated it as something to create. This policy saved countless lives. The abandoned fields slowly turned green again, but it also turned the people into cogs in a war machine. They were alive, but not entirely free. He was both savior and overlord. That contradiction followed him his entire life. But grain only sustains the body. To run this enormous machine, he needed something even more precious than rice: minds. Part 6. Promote only talent. The manifesto that overthrew the old order. With his soldiers fed and his granaries full, Cao Cao faced the next problem. Who would actually run this colossal machine? He needed an entirely new managerial class. And this is when he made the most shocking move of his career. His thinking was identical to Silicon Valley today, willing to hire college dropouts as long as they can code. He did this in the 3rd century, when pedigree was more sacred than anything else on Earth. Every Fortune 500 company takes merit-based hiring for granted now. In his time, this was heresy. To understand why, you need to know the old system. For 400 years under the Han, the only path into government was Zhu Xiaolian, the recommendation of the filial and incorrupt. Filial piety, devotion to one's parents and ancestors, was the supreme virtue in Confucian society. Being nominated was like getting a golden ticket. It sounds noble, but who decided who qualified? Not any kind of exam or objective measure. The great aristocratic families of each region made those decisions. The system created a closed loop of power. Sons of great families praised each other's virtue, nominated each other for office. The government became a bloodline country club. A person of extraordinary talent but low birth was permanently locked out. Cao Cao was a direct victim. Despite the Cao family's wealth and his own education, the aristocracy always looked down on him. The stigma of his birth clung to him like a curse. He understood the rot better than anyone. He had been despised by that very system for half his life. And he decided to smash it. His decree on talent-based promotion was blunt to the point of shock. He wrote, "There are talented men hiding in remote alleys. There are men with bad reputations who possess the skill to govern. I do not care about moral character. I only need ability. Even if a man is unfilial, even if he is unkind, if he has talent, I will use him." This was not a hiring policy. This was a declaration of war on the old order. He was willing to pick a jewel out of the mud rather than worship a pebble wrapped in silk. 17 centuries later, Abraham Lincoln would face a similar challenge,
and reach a similar conclusion. Lincoln filled his cabinet with rivals who despised him because he needed the best minds available to save the Union. Cao Cao did the same in a crisis far bloodier, with even fewer precedents to guide him. Look at the team he assembled. Guo Jia, a military strategist of extraordinary genius, was despised by the aristocracy for his dissolute lifestyle and heavy drinking. Cao Cao loved him so dearly that he wept openly when Guo Jia died young. He said, "Guo Jia understands me best." He did not care how Guo Jia lived. That mind kept producing strategies that decided nations. That was enough. Cheng Yu, one of his most ruthless advisors, was accused in some unofficial sources of using human flesh as military rations during a famine. Abhorrent by any standard, still employed.
He even recruited former enemies. Zhang Liao, one of Lu Bu's best generals, was taken in and given command. He went on to become one of the greatest generals of Cao Wei. His most famous achievement was routing a vastly larger force at the Battle of Hefei. Then there was Jia Shu, a strategist whose schemes had indirectly caused the death of Cao Ang, Cao Cao's eldest son and most beloved heir. Any other man would have executed Jia Shu for revenge. Cao Cao welcomed him with open arms. He knew Jia Shu's brain was worth more than any act of vengeance. He did not need loyalty to the past. He needed competence for the future. Effectiveness was the only measure. This philosophy stripped the aristocracy of privileges held for generations. To them, he was a destroyer of the natural order. That hatred seeped into literature and crystallized into the opera villain that haunts the stage to this day. But the deepest tragedy did not come from external enemies. It came from within, from his closest friend. Xuan Yu, pronounced Xuan Yu, the strategist who had been with him from the earliest desperate days, the chief architect of every political and military victory. Xuan Yu held the capital secure every time Cao Cao marched to war. He recommended dozens of brilliant minds for service. He was the one who saw potential in Guo Jia. He was the one who urged Cao Cao to welcome the emperor. Without Xuan Yu, there might have been no Tun Tian, no political legitimacy, no unified North. He was not just an advisor. He was the foundation on which Cao Cao's empire was built. But Xuan Yu was also loyal to the Han Dynasty to the end. He had helped Cao Cao because he believed his lord would restore the old dynasty. That was the bargain, spoken or unspoken, that bound these two men together for over 20 years. Xuan Yu gave his brilliance. In return, he believed the Han would live. When Cao Cao sought the title of King of Wei, a step closer to the throne, Xuan Yu opposed it. This was the line he refused to cross. Not out of stubbornness, not out of naivety, but because everything he had worked for, every strategy, every recommendation, every sleepless night defending Shu while Cao Cao fought on distant battlefields, had been in service of one dream: a restored Han Dynasty under a capable protector. The title of King of Wei shattered that dream. It told Xuan Yu that the man he had trusted most in this world intended to replace the dynasty, not save it. And Xuan Yu died. According to Chen Shou's records, he took medicine and passed away in the year 212 after falling out of favor. Folk legend says Cao Cao sent him an empty food box, implying there is nothing left to say. The empty box, a container with nothing inside,
Whether this detail is historical fact or later embellishment, the symbolism is devastating. 20 years of partnership, 20 years of shared danger and shared triumph, reduced to an empty box. Whatever the truth, that death marked the end of any hope for reconciliation between Cao Cao and the old order. Did Cao Cao grieve? Could you employ the man whose schemes got your firstborn son killed simply because he was brilliant? Probably, yes, he grieved. The histories do not record him weeping for Xuan Yu the way he wept for Guo Jia. But silence can be louder than tears. Perhaps the grief was too deep for public display. Or perhaps he had already taught himself to seal that door shut. Because opening it would mean questioning every decision that led to this point. And Cao Cao could not afford to question. Not now, not ever. He let it happen. In this man's world, there was no room for hesitation. You either moved forward or you were ground to dust. He was willing to step over even his deepest friendship if it stood in the way of building his new world. That, however ruthless, was the most terrifying consistency of his character. Part 7. The Real Legacy Behind the Chalk-White Face.
Cao Cao failed to unify all of China. The Battle of Red Cliffs in the winter of 208 to 209 CE, one of the most decisive battles in world history, comparable to Actium or Waterloo, ended that dream forever. The allied forces of Sun Quan and Liu Bei used fire to destroy his fleet on the Yangtze. His troops, northerners unfamiliar with naval warfare, were chained together on boats to reduce seasickness. The Allies sent fire ships into the fleet. The chains became a death trap. The inferno consumed everything. He was human, with very human mistakes. Arrogance after a long winning streak, underestimating his enemies, pushing his troops into terrain where their advantages meant nothing. Napoleon would make similar errors at Waterloo 17 centuries later. But we should also be honest about darker stains that no amount of context can wash away. The massacre at Su province. Cao Cao's forces slaughtered civilians in retaliation for his father's murder. The Sanguozhi records that bodies choked the Xi River until it stopped flowing. His ruthless treatment of dissent? Advisors who opposed him too firmly sometimes died under suspicious circumstances. Kong Rong, a famous scholar and descendant of Confucius, was executed, according to the Sanguozhi, along with his family for daring to criticize Cao Cao publicly. These were not accidents of war. They were deliberate acts of a man who believed order justified almost any price. Acknowledging this does not weaken the case for his rehabilitation. It strengthens it. Because the real Cao Cao, a man of towering achievement and genuine cruelty, of poetry and massacre, is far more interesting than either the opera villain or the spotless hero. Even after Red Cliffs, Cao Wei remained the strongest of the three kingdoms. Wei in the north under Cao Cao's family, Shu in the southwest under Liu Bei, Wu in the southeast under Sun Quan. They would coexist in a tense balance for decades. Wei dominated not because it held the most territory, but because it had the most systematic governance and the deepest pool of talent. And beyond the battlefield and the court, there was another Cao Cao, the novel almost completely ignored: the poet. In the West, we rarely think of warlords as literary figures. But imagine if Julius Caesar had written poetry as powerful as Virgil's. That is the closest analogy. Cao Cao is considered one of the founders of Chinese literary tradition.
His poems are still studied in schools across China today. His poem, Hao Li Xing, Marching Through the Ruins, was an eyewitness account of civil war. Bai gu lu yu ye, qian li wu ji ming. White bones lie exposed in the fields. For 1,000 miles, no rooster crows. The rooster crowing at dawn was the universal sound of village life in ancient China. Its absence meant there were no villages left. Who writes those two lines without a heart that knows suffering? But the poem does not stop there. It continues. 生民百亿矣，年至断人长. Of the living, barely 1 in 100 remains. To think of it tears at one's guts. This is not the language of a bureaucratic report. This is a man standing in the wreckage, looking at what war has done, and feeling the weight of it in his own body. 1,000 years later, poets would still cite these lines as the standard for writing about human suffering. They carry the same raw power as Wilfred Owen describing the trenches of World War I. The difference is that Cao Cao was not merely a witness. He was also the general. He carried both the pen and the sword, and the guilt of knowing his own campaigns had added bodies to those fields.
His 短歌性，对酒当歌，人胜几何，譬如赵鲁，曲里库夺。Raise the cup and sing, for how long is a life? Like morning dew, so many days have already slipped away. These are not the words of a heartless brute. They are the sigh of a man carrying a nation on his shoulders, knowing time waits for no one. The image of morning dew, beautiful for a moment, then gone, captures the melancholy of a man who understood that even his greatest victories were temporary. In the same poem, 善不言告，害不言甚，周公吐哺，天下归心. The mountain never tires of being high. The sea never tires of being deep. The Duke of Zhou spat out his food to welcome guests, and the world gave him its heart. A man who could only destroy does not write lines like these. The Duke of Zhou was the model of the selfless regent, a man who held supreme power but used it only to serve the young king. By invoking him, Cao Cao revealed what he wanted to be remembered as, not a usurper, a protector. History would deny him that wish. He did not just write poetry, he created an entire literary movement. Under his patronage, the Jian'an era became one of the golden ages of Chinese literature. It produced the 7 masters of Jian'an alongside his own sons Cao Pi and Cao Zhi. Cao Pi became the first emperor of Wei. He also authored one of the earliest works of literary criticism in Chinese history. Cao Zhi is still regarded as one of the greatest poets China ever produced. The Cao family dominated both the political and literary worlds, as if Augustus Caesar had also been Shakespeare. Without Jian'an, Tang Dynasty poetry, the pinnacle of Chinese verse, might have turned out very differently. He also reformed the legal code and built infrastructure. He reduced the barbaric collective punishments of the old Han system. He made laws apply equally to nobility and commoner alike. He ordered large-scale irrigation networks across the north. Under his management, northern China was transformed from a graveyard into the most prosperous region among the 3 kingdoms. These achievements are rarely mentioned. They are not as dramatic as schemes and stratagems, but they are the real legacy. Cao Cao was no saint. He killed, he deceived, he ordered massacres. Those stains are real.
But he was also not the chalk-white demon the stage has painted for 600 years. The final question is not, was Cao Cao good or evil? Slapping a moral label on a figure this complex is like pouring the ocean into a glass. The real question is, if his iron hand had not held the North together for 30 years, what would have become of China? When the North did eventually fall to the steppe peoples in the early 4th century, it plunged the country into 3 centuries of suffering. Some historians call it China's own fall of Rome. Cao Cao's iron hand had delayed that catastrophe by 100 years. History has no what-ifs, but history has facts. Between 2008 and 2009, archaeologists confirmed a tomb in Anyang, Henan province. It was not lavish. Compare it to the first emperor of Qin's vast underground palace and terracotta army, or the Egyptian pharaohs buried beneath mountains of gold. Cao Cao's tomb was remarkably humble. This was Gaoling. In his will, he had instructed, "Bury me in plain clothes. Do not place gold or jade in the tomb." The man the world called a greedy villain chose a grave more modest than any minor official of his era. Perhaps that is Meng De's final smile. Not the sinister grin of the opera stage, but the quiet smile of a man who knew that truth can be buried, but it never dies.